And I'm so very excited for all of us this morning to be able to listen to Tom and to ask Tom questions and to spend time with him. Tom's presence here in the Fully Alive Forum is particularly moving to me because he has had part of his life work, the full actualization and his understanding what that means to be a human being in his life and in all of our lives. Tom has one of the most compelling life stories of anybody I've ever known, and by my work I've had a chance to know so many people. I perhaps know nobody who's had greater peaks and greater valleys, more times of trial, moments of redemption. It's not summarizable in any way, except that I just have to tell you, this book, this memoir that Tom authored through the Cornell Press, I highly recommend to you. I was captivated by it over my summer vacation, and I think that you will enjoy it too. It has an iconic Pulitzer Prize-winning photograph on the cover of Tom coming out of Willard Straight Hall. Tom, you're a man of incredible character and spiritual depth and incredible life energy, and we're all honored and delighted to have you come up here this morning and speak to us about something that is all on our hearts, which is the question of race in America today. So Tom, come up and talk to us.
Thank you, Peter. Good morning. I'm going to speak for about 20 minutes, and then we'll have 20 or 25 minutes for discussion. But if you want to break in and ask a question at any time, please do so. My homemade war club, studded with nails, dangled from my belt, hitting my right thigh. There was also a long butcher knife tucked into my waistband. This is not what I had expected from college, not at all. Someone down the darkened hallway coughed, and I picked up my rifle by its strap and slung it across my shoulder. Guns, knives, a 2-day standoff with the university authorities. I hadn't really slept in 40 hours, and now it was morning again. I was 19 years old. I stood near the ground floor rear entrance of Willard Straight Hall, the 5-story student union building on Cornell University's campus. The electricity had been turned off, but the white light of a cold, overcast April day shone in through the tall windows. Outside, dozens of police waited, and hundreds more armed sheriffs, as many as 400 we had heard, were amassed downtown, ready to move in on us. The rumors were nonstop. We couldn't know for sure what was true and what was a lie, a fantasy, or a hysterical guess. Below, circling the building, was a growing gaggle of reporters from local and national newspapers. My mind raced to put the situation into perspective. If we are attacked by either those police or by more vigilantes, I'll fight, I decided. That will make for some surprising news. Parents' Weekend, 1969. Dozens of armed black students at an Ivy League school fighting for educational relevance, giving their lives just to have black history and culture claim its rightful place in the curriculum. I thought I might be killed if we fought, but I wasn't afraid. Dying isn't the worst thing that can happen to a person. In fact, the idea of my own death as I stood there, not knowing what would happen next, struck me as a sacrifice I had to be willing to make. Hadn't I often mused that if I had been born in slavery, I would have tried to start a slave rebellion? Or if I had been born in 1845, I would have tried to join the colored troops in the Union Army to fight for my freedom on Civil War battlefields in the face of deadly cannon and rifle fire? If I had been born in 1925, I would have wanted to fight on the battlefields of World War II against the Nazis. Now, since I was the prime age for it, I might soon be drafted into the U.S. Army to join other young black soldiers who were dying in disproportionate numbers on battlefields in Vietnam. But it was more than a romantic daydream. The idea of my own death right there on campus, maybe right in this big, cold building. Just 14 months earlier, 30 unarmed black students had been shot by police during a demonstration at South Carolina State University, and 3 of them had died from their wounds. Just 2 years earlier, in 1967, in what had been called the Long Hot Summer, there were race riots, also called armed uprisings, in over 100 U.S. cities, with hundreds of people killed and thousands injured. And the previous 12 months witnessed the assassination of Martin Luther King, and Robert Kennedy, the bloody confrontation at the 1968 Democratic National Convention in Chicago, and Marines with machine guns positioned on the steps of the United States Capitol building during a riot in Washington, D.C. In 1969, I lived in a violent world, so I was comforted by the thought that at least I was choosing my own cause, and it was a good and just cause. The fight for black freedom and equality in America had already claimed many worthy lives and would undoubtedly claim many more. I was fully committed to the fight. That was an excerpt from my autobiography, From Willard Straight to Wall Street, published in April by Cornell University Press. 50 years ago, I was an angry young man in my senior year at Cornell University. Mentally and emotionally, I was prepared to meet my destiny in a struggle against oppression and injustice that was much larger than any one of us, and even larger than all of us. I thought we were the generation fingered by history to draw the line on America's ill treatment of its black population. It had to stop with us in our time. Today, I'm going to briefly step back in time to explain how America and I came to be in that situation 50 years ago, and what has happened in America in the ensuing 50 years. Cheap Negro slave labor powered America's explosive economic growth for 200 years between the mid-1600s and the mid-1800s. Tobacco, cotton, and sugarcane were the cash crops which were a key pillar of American economic growth, and capital accumulation was facilitated by capturing excess profits from slave labor. The southern states prospered from agricultural cultivation and sale of these crops, and the northern states prospered from manufacturing the requisite tools and equipment, and the shipping industry which transported the crops, equipment, and slaves. Following the Civil War and the Emancipation Proclamation, which freed the slaves, the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution was enacted in 1868 and granted citizenship to former slaves and guaranteed all citizens equal protection of the laws. White Southerners organized the Ku Klux Klan in the 1870s to terrorize and intimidate the former slaves from exercising their citizenship rights, especially the right to vote. With control of the ballot box, many Southern states enacted vagrancy laws which criminalized minor offenses, imposed onerous cash bail requirements, and authorized the states to operate convict leasing programs to secure payment of bail. This system drove mass incarceration of black men, and some historians describe it as slavery by another name. Beginning in the 1870s and continuing until the 1960s, many states enacted Jim Crow laws which denied equal treatment for black Americans in public accommodations, employment, housing, voting, and other civil rights. The petty discrimination of being denied access to public facilities was intended to dehumanize African Americans and to proclaim every day that we were different and inferior. In the 1950s, I personally experienced this on trips to visit my relatives in Virginia and North Carolina, when my father always asked if we were allowed to use the restrooms before he would purchase gas. Violence against African Americans was common. For example, the Elaine, Arkansas massacre in 1919 saw 237 black people die in the course of white mob attacks. In the Tulsa, Oklahoma race riot of 1921, mobs of white residents attacked black residents, homes, and businesses of the Greenwood district, which was known as Black Wall Street due to its prosperity. Using guns, explosives, and incendiary devices, they killed hundreds of black people and left 10,000 homeless. The National Memorial for Peace and Justice, which recently opened in Montgomery, Alabama, has documented over 4,400 terror lynchings of black people in the years 1877 through 1950. To put this in perspective, this equates to an average of one black person lynched somewhere in the United States every week for 73 consecutive years. In the 1930s, Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal legislation was blocked by white Southern congressmen until most black Americans were excluded from benefiting. For example, Social Security was enacted with exclusions for domestic and farm workers, which were the predominant employment categories for blacks at that time. The National Housing Act of 1934 created the Federal Housing Administration, FHA, and the Federal Savings and Loan Insurance Corporation, FSLIC, which eventually became the backbone of the mortgage and home building industries. But most predominantly black neighborhoods were redlined and declared ineligible for these housing programs. So Social Security and government-supported home mortgages, the two federal government programs which have done the most to lift Americans out of poverty and build the middle class, were designed in ways which excluded most black Americans from benefiting. This systemic institutional denial of economic opportunities ensured that African Americans remained poor and powerless. It is a major reason that an enormous racial wealth gap continues to prevail in America even today. This history is why I'm proud that my colleagues and I in the 1960s had the courage to say that the oppression and intimidation of African Americans would stop with our generation. We put our lives on the line and we were prepared to fight about it. But it's also true that American history is complicated and multidimensional. American history abounds in every generation with many white Americans of conscience and goodwill who supported African American freedom and equality. This honor roll includes the abolitionist movement during slavery, President Abraham Lincoln and the 300,000 Union soldiers, mostly white, who were killed or wounded in the Civil War, Leaders like Eleanor Roosevelt, who insisted that black men, including my wife Addie's father, received the opportunity to train as combat pilots in World War II. And Presidents John Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson, who shepherded the breakthrough of civil rights legislation of the 1960s. Kennedy's and Johnson's legislative accomplishments include the President's Commission on Equal Employment Opportunity, created by executive order in 1961, which required government contractors to take affirmative action to ensure employment and treatment with regard to race, creed, color, or national origin. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 that outlawed discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. The Voting Rights Act of 1965, which outlawed discriminatory voting practices adopted in many southern states after the Civil War, including literacy tests as a prerequisite to voting. And the Fair Housing Act of 1968, which protects the buyer or renter of a dwelling from seller or landlord discrimination. When I left Cornell in 1972, I thought that America had come to a metaphorical fork in the road in the 1960s and had chosen the left fork towards racial inclusion and equality, rather than the right fork towards racial oppression and suppression. I wanted to participate in this potential new America, and I wanted to return to my roots of faith and optimism. What is the scorecard 50 years later with regard to America's journey on the road to racial inclusion and equality? African Americans have achieved success and prominence at the highest levels of every occupation and profession in business, law, medicine, the arts, academia, entertainment, athletics, and government. African Americans can live wherever they choose, constrained only by economic capacity. De jure discrimination against African Americans is no longer enshrined in American law and the judicial system. An African American has been elected president of the United States. My purpose in reciting this history is both to remind us of where we have been and to consider how far we have come. Objective historical reflection makes an undeniable case that African Americans have widespread educational, economic, and social opportunities today, which are unprecedented in American history. Does this mean that America has completely overcome its historical problems? Of course not. The legacy of hundreds of years of slavery and the related physical and psychological barbarity against African Americans created a scale of human misery and dysfunctionality which cannot be reversed in just 50 years. But is America moving towards inclusive civic equality and equal opportunity? Unequivocally, yes. My thesis in no way diminishes the important work that Black Lives Matters and other groups do today to bring attention to ongoing police and vigilante violence against African Americans and widespread poverty among African Americans. But we should acknowledge and celebrate the truth that for every incident of racial violence against African Americans which occurs today, the frequency of such incidents was proportionately 50 times greater 50 years ago, and probably 100 times greater 100 years ago. We should acknowledge and celebrate the truth that many millions of African Americans have lifted themselves out of poverty into the middle class and even higher. We should acknowledge and celebrate the truth that African Americans occupy important positions in the executive, legislative, and judicial branches of government at local, state, and federal levels across the country. So even as I am acutely aware of how far we have yet to go, I am enormously thankful for how far America has come in the past 50 years. In closing, I want to say that I am concerned now, in the autumn of my years, with America's current drift into angry racial, cultural, and political rhetoric and divisions. Our public discourse seems focused incessantly on negatives, the things that divide us. We rarely celebrate the success and progress our country has achieved. Celebration of our country's success, along with acknowledgement of our shortcomings, is necessary for our collective social psyche. Just as raising a healthy child requires celebration of their achievements, in addition to discussing their shortfalls, so it is also true for our broader social fabric. I wrote my book in part to deliver this message to America. I pray that our country continues its progress and that we become a country which celebrates our diversity within the context of overarching bonds of community. Thank you. Any comments, questions, observations? Yes, sir.
How was your standoff in '69 resolved, and what were the consequences?
It was resolved by the university administration recognizing that this could quickly spin out of control. I mean, the reason we were armed was that, it was a standard kind of student demonstration when we took over the building. And a white fraternity, Delta Upsilon, broke into a side window of the student union building because they decided we shouldn't be occupying the building, and they were going to take it into their own hands to end the occupation. I wasn't in the leadership of the black students because I didn't think the takeover was a good idea. I was playing pool, and I heard the arguing in the hallway, and I went out to see what was going on, and the people were arguing with these fraternity guys who had broken in. And it just flashed through my mind, this is like the vigilantes in the 1870s. I mean, we have an issue with the administration, and here come these vigilantes deciding that they're going to take it over. I went up to the first guy and I said, we're not talking about this anymore. I punched him in the mouth. We fought, we threw them out of the building, but that's when we got the guns. I was one of the people that went out and got the guns, okay? The administration recognized this could spin out of control really quickly. Noises in the night, somebody fires off a shot. And so they negotiated a settlement which enabled us to leave the building the next day. There was a clause that the faculty had to approve the settlement, but that was going to be 2 days later. I was one of the people charged with criminal trespass, but the charges were ultimately, which was a misdemeanor, not a felony, but they were ultimately dismissed in court anyway. So and then years later, probably more than you want to know in this answer, but years later, I was so appreciative of the president who had made the decision to end the occupation, and he had been the president who had actually initiated substantial recruitment of black students, starting in 1965, which was my freshman year. I endowed a prize at Cornell in his honor, and he was forced out. He was forced to resign because there was the faculty, the trustees, the alumni, they were so angry at what had happened. He was forced to resign, but I endowed a prize at the university years later in his honor, and he was able to come to, it's called the Perkins Prize for racial progress, and he attended the opening ceremony when the prize was first awarded and gave a really nice talk which said that, and this was, it got a lot of coverage at the university and the pictures of him and I shaking hands, and he said this he couldn't think of anything that more represented what he was trying to achieve, with the recruitment of black students than what this prize stated. So it ended peacefully. Many years of what I would call ripped fabric at Cornell, healed by that gesture towards the president. And now you'd be interested to know this, in Cornell's sesquicentennial celebration, which their 150th celebration, which was in 2015, and this meant programs that went on all over the country. It was done as kind of a dramatic show. And so there were presentations in New York, Washington, San Francisco, Los Angeles, Atlanta, Palm Beach, Miami, London, Hong Kong. The university asked me to be part of the show, talking about what had happened in 1969, which they now consider to be a part of Cornell's history that they're proud of because it represents the Cornell motto, an institution. I would found an institution where any person can find instruction in any study. And so there's been a healing at Cornell's campus, which out of all of that trauma, and I hope that that's emblematic of what can happen in America. Yes, Eric.
Tom, I've known you a long time, and known you as a man of gentleness and grace and quiet and strength in your faith. 50 years ago, as I read the book, you had a lot of anger, and anger drove a lot of what was going on in the 60s between races. What have you done with your anger? How have you dealt with the anger, and where's it gone?
Well, what I was angry about was not just the injustice that had occurred historically, but my sense that, just as you cannot enslave a person unless they cooperate to a certain degree. You can kill them for resisting enslavement, but you can't enslave a person unless they cooperate at some level. And my anger was in part a sense that this would have ended a long time ago if enough African Americans had raised the price. And the way you raise the price in a society like this is you got to fight about it. That's America's history. For all that's in our Constitution, America is a warring country. And so I perceive this as a society. You have to fight. And it's to fight. Anger is a useful emotion. One of my determinations after Cornell was to master that anger, channel it. Anger is just a form of energy. And so I tried to channel that same energy into, this effort to participate in the new America. And, I figured I thought the toughest fight would be in the business world, because that's where the money is, and I figured that's where the greatest resistance would be. And so I said, that's where I want to do my fight. I figured I had almost no chance of success, not only because of the still prevailing discrimination, no matter what the law said, that didn't necessarily change attitudes immediately, but I also had the label, there's the black radical from Cornell. So I figured I had almost no chance of success. And I decided, the way you have to approach this is you can't seek reinforcement, you can't seek positive support from those around you. You're probably, it's extremely unlikely that you're going to receive that The only things you can control, you got to control what you can control, and the only things you can control are your attitude, your demeanor, and how hard you work, and what the quality of your work. And so I developed a mentality where I said, focus every day on the things you can control. And I learned that as I put my energy into that, I learned that when you give maximum effort, there's actually quite a difference between 100% and 90 or 95%, which is where most people function. Because we're in school, we learn that's an A, so what do you want? You already have an A. There's actually quite a gap between 90, 95, and 100. And that's where my energy went. As I learned to just focus on what I could do every day and try to excel every day, because I might be fired at any time, but I wanted to be able to walk away saying, you did everything you could do. And that's where it went, Eric. It just got channeled into that energy that was, and I discovered something. I mean, again, as I said in my talk, America's always had lots of good people, and I was picked up by good people who became my mentors. The top people in corporate America, the ones that are most successful in some respects, are like sports coaches. They win because they build good teams, and so they're always looking for people. And I got picked up by folks who said, this guy's doing good work. And then as they would pick me up, they gave me protection, they gave me promotions, they gave me compensation. And so, again, my anger got absorbed as I began to see there's a way here. There's a way. And then finally, I had the good fortune of some extraordinarily positive religious experiences. I came from a faith family. My father was a minister, so that was the core of my faith. But in 1982, Addie and I, decided that it was time for us to get back to regular church going. And at her urging, we went to, I had been raised as a Presbyterian. We went to an Episcopal church in Boston, Trinity Church in Copley Square, which is known as one of the great preaching pulpits of America. And the new rector at Trinity Church was Spencer Morgan Rice, who was an extraordinarily gifted theologian, and this is in the tradition of Phillips Brooks and other great preachers that they have had at Trinity. And we became good friends. His sermons were just extraordinary, and they focused. One of the best books of all time was The Road Less Traveled, written by F. Scott Peck. And he preached from the themes in that book quite a bit. That really helped me to grow. And out of that, I developed certain disciplines. And so one of my disciplines in 1982, I came to realize, the Bible may be the most important book in the history of the world. Isn't it foolish to go through life without reading that for yourself? And so, think about that. Greatest book in the history of the world. How many people die without ever reading it? 1982, I read it cover to cover. And so those kind of, just came together for me. The association with Spencer Rice, reflecting on his sermons, reading books like The Road Less Traveled, reading the Bible. And then, credit to my wife, Addie, the joy in my personal life was just extraordinary. It's hard to be angry when you really, really, really love somebody, So I was just really fortunate. Could have ended very differently, you know.
One of the things that's always been interesting on a model career, is which yours certainly is, as one of the most successful New Canaanites and national role models, which I congratulate you on. It's always interesting on how that first job after Cornell was hired into what I call a white shoe consulting company. Somebody had a great vision. Could you tell us about that?
Well, it was actually not my first job. What had happened, my first job was when I was writing, in 1969, I got my bachelor's degree at Cornell. I thought there was so much anger at the university with the forcing out of President Perkins. The trustees were so angry. I said, there's a good chance that unless somebody stays to make sure what we accomplished in the Black Studies program, getting this program up and going. We've gotten the money for it. We had a building. We had somebody hired to be the director. I said, there's a good chance that the bureaucracy is just going to reverse this and wipe it out because they're so angry. So I decided to stay at Cornell and do a master's degree and kind of be the watchdog, that what we had won, actually came into fruition, because the greatest tragedy of all is to go through that and nothing be accomplished. So my first job, I was doing a master's in planning, and I was working at a health planning agency in Binghamton, New York. And I had a project which was research into what was an experimental form of medicine at that time, health maintenance organizations. And the director of that agency is a white man from the Middle West. His name was Dick Landis. So this is my first professional work experience working for him in upstate New York. He was hired to become the national director of healthcare consulting at Arthur Young and Company, one of the big 8 public accounting firms, okay? He called me then, this was 2 years later, would you like to work for me again and come to Arthur Young? And so that's how that connection into the white shoe world, of the upper tier of American business. And then my whole career has just been a series of stories like that. The people that I've worked for said, would you do this for me again? And that's how it's evolved, just whole series, probably 6 or 7 different people like that over the course of, 40 years.
You talk about these relationships, and this way everybody can hear you. Thank you for being here today, and it's so interesting to hear you talk about those relationships. What advice do you have for those of us white people who feel that on a relationship level, on a one-on-one, we would say, I'm not a racist. I have many black friends and coworkers, and I love black people, and black power, yay, but we don't see this sort of bigger, the systemic picture. How can we sort of reckon with this history and our involvement in it up till the present day, and how can we be good allies?
Well, one of the reasons I structured my talk the way I did is because a lot of that history that I was describing isn't commonly known or acknowledged in America. Our schools still, to this day, don't really teach the true history of America. And in part, that's because it's embarrassing. It's embarrassing, frankly embarrassing, to think that this country hasn't been the land of freedom and justice and equality for everybody in the way that we like to tell ourselves. That was the historical foundation. So the first thing is to understand that history and be open with those discussions, even as you also say, at the end of the day, knowing this history and understanding how we got to be where we are today, even as I understand and I'm sympathetic, at the end of the day, none of us can change the history, right? It is what it is. And so the only thing any of us can do is engage constructively and positively in terms of what's the best way to move forward together. And so that kind of openness and honesty, I know what happened to you. I feel for what happened to you. And I would like to be your partner and your friend in moving this country forward. I think that kind of openness and honesty. And you know, one of the things I understand is that as horrific as the African American story is, we're not the only people in the world that have those kind of stories, you know. Bad things have happened to lots of people in lots of countries. America isn't the only place where bad things have happened. So, you know, acknowledging the history, but always coming out with a positive, I want to partner with you and I want to be constructive engagement moving forward.
Tom, don't go anywhere. I just want to, in Tom's talk today, which we're all riveted to, I'm sorry that the time is coming and going so quickly. You can find more of this in a talk that Tom gave at Cornell, as you referred to. It's on the Cornell website, and it is utterly riveting. It's 2 hours and ends with a great question and answer. In that, Tom, you say a little bit about your prayer life and the reference to Romans that all things that come for the love of God come to good. I've got the order in the wrong. You just say one word about that and just a moment about your prayer life as we finish up here.
Well, I for a number of years, you know, I developed one of the disciplines I developed, to Eric's point, was 3 significant goals every year. Sometimes it was technical kind of goal, sometimes it was a physical health related type of goal. Third category was spiritual development. And in that category of spiritual development, I developed prayer disciplines every morning, every evening. Some are prayers that are from the Bible or from the Book of Common Prayer. Others are prayers that I've shaped for myself. And what Father Peter's referring to is that the worst moment of my career, when I was fired in a really brutal fashion by Citigroup, and you'll find that story in the book. Just shattering kind of thing. And I had to pray, you know. I prayed for the strength to figure out what to do and how to pick myself up. And it was a story. And what Peter's referring to, one of my prayers has the phrase, all things work together for good to those who love God. So my prayer when I was fired was, help me understand. Help me find the good in what's happened here. Still makes me emotional. And it turned out, it took 8 years, but it actually did turn out to be a blessing in the way that things unfolded for me. And so that's.
No, I don't stop. I mean, in this your discussion of preparation for the time of trial, and that all of us in our lives come into a time of trial. And I would just say that from my perspective, the truth of that is overwhelming, as I see so many people in our world in deep times of trial. And so we're really grateful to you for sharing your life and sharing your prayer life and sharing. I just have to say, Tom has only scratched the surface, and the book is really riveting, and you can get a copy in the back, and Tom will sign it for you also. And before you go here, I also, Elise had to step out because she's going to be working as a minister of communion this morning. But next week, Lise Least, long time, 30-year friend of you and Addie, and Jeff in the back here, so is going to speak about race, equity, and inclusion, and so I hope you'll come and be a part of that also. Tom, God bless you. What a treat for all of us. Yeah, thank you. Appreciate it.